Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing this week's talks between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Joining us from New Delhi is Pramit Palchowdhury, the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times from Beijing. We're joined by Hu Shisheng. He's an expert in China-India relations. And here with me in the studio in Washington, D.C. is Tanvi Madan. She's the director of the India project with the Brookings Institution. And Tanvi, let me start with you again. We talked earlier on about the personal relationship between these two leaders, Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping. Prime Minister Modi has had a history with China. He saw the attraction, if I could put it that way, of courting China a long time ago when he was the chief minister of the state of Gujarat, didn't he?
Yes, he actually isn't somebody who came in without foreign policy experience. He actually did travel a fair bit as chief minister, not just to China, but to another country that Pramit mentioned earlier, Japan, as well as to Israel and other countries. And the reason he went to China was to seek markets for Gujarati business and to seek investment into Gujarat. And so I think he's not a stranger to this country. He has admiration for China's economic achievements, but he's also very realistic and states that the political situation in India is quite different, that he is leading a democracy, and that makes a difference to how he actually has to deal with many of the things that come on his desk, including getting things done on the economic side.
Pramit, what are the major challenges that face these two countries? I mean, the Indian foreign minister recently said, and he described it this way, he said, look, when you look at the relationship between these two countries, there is cooperation and there is competition.
Yes, I think one of the key issues, one of the key mindsets that is particularly strong in India is the sense that this is a zero-sum relationship. That if China accomplishes something, building a port, building a railway that comes close to South Asia or to the Indian Ocean, this is automatically a negative for India. And that mindset is going to take a long time to change because it effectively comes out of the mistrust that exists on the security front between the two countries. It was mentioned that the Silk Route, the Silk Two projects, the land one and the maritime one, that Xi Jinping has cited as being the sort of core of his thinking regarding the integration of Asia and China's role in it. There was no mention of it in the joint statement that was issued between Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping. And I think this is an indication of exactly the type of distrust that continues to lie between the two countries. That the Indian side, I suspect, basically said, we're not endorsing this because we're not certain that this is not necessarily against India's interests. But Xi had cited this repeatedly as being something that he hoped to accomplish. He'd gone to the Maldives, he'd gone to Sri Lanka before he came to India and got them to endorse this, but the Indian side has basically said no. And I think this is going to be one of the long-term measures or indices of how much Xi can change that relationship, or how much he and Modi can change that relationship, is whether or not eventually the Silk Route is endorsed by India or continues to be seen with suspicion. So as I said, the $20 billion investment is effectively a down payment in beginning to slowly water down or dilute that distrust. But it's going to be a relatively long haul for both sides. But the key about again having that $20 billion investment and opening up to Indian investment on the other side will be that it wipes out, or at least shows that what happens between India and China is not necessarily a zero-sum game, which at present I would argue continues to dominate the thinking between the two countries.
All right, Hu Shisheng, we've heard these two leaders talk about the mutual benefits of the economic relationship, but can this economic relationship expand into more cooperation on the diplomatic and political front? I mean, they already work together in certain multilateral forums like BRICS, but China is now talking about supporting a bigger role for India at the United Nations, possible Indian participation in the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. Do we see greater cooperation politically and diplomatically?
Of course, in the future, that because we have enjoyed more commonalities, especially in the global developmental issues, we have cooperated in the past for so many years in the BRICS, in WTO, how to safeguarding the free trade regime, and also how to rounds of negotiations for environmental protections or climate changes. I think we already have enjoyed so many commonalities. In the future, especially with the bilateral economic has become intertwined, become interdependent, I think they will provide more favorable environment or the conditions for both countries to make more contributions, not only to the two peoples, but also to this region. During this trip, we found that, especially Chinese president already said that India and China could do more contributions to the regional integrations, like the RCEP, and also like the BCI. I mean the economic corridors. My personal observation, understanding is that whether it is economic corridors or whether it is a maritime Silk Road, it is just like a public platform, or just like platform for all of us can provide public goods toward the other. It can be used by all the parties who got interested. So it is inclusive, not exclusive. Among those guys, those giants, like the big countries like China and India, should take more responsibilities, more duties in providing such kind of goods to the this region and the world as well.
I think one of the, sorry, I was just going to say, I think one of the things you've seen across the last few years, and it goes to something both Hu Shisheng and Promit have talked about, multilateral cooperation has not been a problem, or as much as a problem for China and India. It's been the bilateral and the regional side that has been more problematic. So you've seen India and China cooperate, including in the UN before. You've seen them in the BRICS, but also on multilateral issues, including trade and climate change. It's these bilateral regional issues, including some of these corridors, where, as Promit said, it's this underlying lack of trust, which plays across many aspects of the relationship, that the two leaders and their governments will need to try to focus on and take it on head-on in terms of how do you actually try to alleviate some of this. Some of this will just take time, because it will take actions proving that both have the best intentions. Some of it will take a habit of cooperation, but that has not been, it's not been a problem as much on the multilateral side, whereas on the bilateral and regional side, it's very much present.
Okay, let's look at regional politics, Tanvi. Does this visit, a very high-profile visit by the Chinese leader to India, eclipse in some way the relationship that India has with other countries in the region, especially with Japan? I mean, let's not forget that the Japanese investment in India, they've pledged $35 billion. We'd expected China to top that, but China has promised $20 billion. And there is, I understand, a closer relationship between Narendra Modi and Shinzo Abe, the Japanese leader. They're both nationalists to a large extent.
As somebody I heard say, which country's leader isn't a nationalist? Mm-hmm. If they're not, should you worry about them, because they should be nationalists? I think you're right in the sense that you do see a very different relationship, and you saw this. I'm not one for body language analysis, but you did see a difference between how Mr. Modi and Mr. Abe engaged. That's partly because they've known each other for years. They've met on Mr. Modi's trips to Japan, even when he was chief minister, and even when Mr. Abe was in opposition. So I think they've had that relationship. Japan has also been involved economically in India and on the development aid side for a lot longer. I think on the volume of economic commitment, I think as Promit said, it's a pretty good start. It will be compared, and that's why I think some of the problem was that what they had put out there in terms of preparing the media for the trip had put out expectations of $100 billion over 5 years, and that's actually what I think set unrealistic expectations. So you see some kind of carping about, well, look, this is not enough. I do think it's a good start, though, and I think what you're going to see is potentially, because this is a commitment, whether it actually gets to India and is invested in India will also depend on Indian actions, including trying to get some of the infrastructure hurdles or the policy hurdles that were involved in infrastructure development sorted out.
Promit, if I could ask you for a brief answer, because we're running out of time, but how do you think this burgeoning relationship between China and India is being viewed by Washington?
I don't think Washington has any serious problems with this relationship, partly because the India-US relationship needs a fair amount of repair. And Obama has been reaching out to China himself. But the key areas of friction between the US and China are largely in the Western Pacific, which is a part of the world where India really doesn't have any capacities or influence. I think that we will see some commonalities. All these three countries, the US, China, are, for example, very concerned about what's happening in the Middle East right now, and to some extent in Afghanistan. But I think for the most part, the US is not really a player right now in the Asian geopolitical equation between India and China and Japan. And in fact, quite a lot of it is now being run quite independently of Washington. Washington is not really opposed to what's happening, but it's not there as an active player.
Hu Shisheng, we've heard repeatedly that there is a lack of trust between these two countries, and one of the purposes of this visit is to regain that trust. To what extent does this visit contribute to that goal of regaining trust, building trust between the two nations?
I think it is through more and more communications like this kind of top leaders trip or state visit or top leaders meeting more and more and building more and more of make the current, at least the current mechanisms to be more and more functional, and also should have both of the countries and especially leaders should have a bigger heart when they regarding the others' development relations with the third parties. In such a globalized world, we should give up this kind of zero-sum game conceptions or Cold War mentalities. For example, that if really Japan invests a huge amount of money in improving the infrastructure conditions, in enhancing the capacities of manufacturing of India, that is very good for China also, because it will cultivate a huge consumer market in India. That means China will have a big opportunities in the future, because when the road, whether it is road invested by China or by Japan, it doesn't matter. All the parties can use it.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us.